So today I am joined by JPM. He is a beginner at chess, and I think by beginner I mean he's had a few hours of experience. So we're going to do a quick lesson, probably break into a few sections, maybe looking at the board, the pieces, some basics there, and maybe hop into a few games after that and do some analysis and chat through it. So you want to say what's up, JP?
What's going on, guys? This is JPM. I am happy to be on Crimson Stream today. And as he said, maybe 2 hours is a little bit of a stretch. So this is starting right from the beginning, and I'm happy to jump into it.
So quickly, yeah. So what do you know? Do you remember the pieces you said briefly?
Yeah, so I do know the pieces. We got our pawns, knights,
Can you see
bishops,
as I highlight
rooks,
things here just
queens.
to make sure?
Let me take a look.
I'm trying to.
Yes, I can.
Okay, that's
Yep.
perfect then. Yes, run the analysis board just so everyone knows. It's a really good tool on chess.com. You can obviously invite people and just kind of work through moves so it doesn't have to be a live game. If I highlight a piece, you want to try to name it or tell me anything you know about it?
Yeah, let's start
And I
there.
can shout a little more after that. Okay, so you said pawns. I'll start with there. Talk about movement if you could.
So, from what I understand, they can move vertically
Yep,
one step unless it's the first move, and then they can move two.
perfect. So um, commonly, in a game, the first move will be one of your central pawns, so D or E. When I say D or E, the file here, the vertical, the letters are down here. Can you see them? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. So yeah, like I often play E4 as the first move, um, and there's other reasons for that. I'll jump into it, but as you said, it can move two squares. D4 is also very common. I'll
Okay.
go back here. Do you remember how they capture?
I do not.
So they capture, they're the only piece that'll capture diagonally. So again, really commonly, if I play e4, sometimes our opponent will play pawn to d5 there. And
Okay.
instead of capturing the piece that's right in front of them, they capture sideways. So it gets a little unique in trying to remember that.
And is that if they're right next to each other, so to speak?
Exactly. So like only
Okay.
these two, like if my opponent had played this move instead, so pawn to e5, these
Mhm.
just can't move, neither of them.
Interesting. They're just kind of locked
They're
there
just kind of
until.
stuck. Exactly. So you call
Okay.
that closed, meaning like this whole line is closed off because you can't move pieces through there.
Interesting. All right, that's good to know.
So if we got pawns, we'll jump this guy. A little important.
Is that the king?
That is the king. Do you remember how he moves?
I do not. I
He'll move
do
one
not.
square in any direction. He can't move right now, obviously, because there's pieces around him. So any of these pieces are only going to move to an open square unless they're capturing a piece. But like I can't capture my own pieces here. And
Gotcha.
he is important because if he gets captured, the game is over. So you
Gotcha.
want to protect him. You're generally going to leave him in a safe place until the very end of the game when he becomes a little more mobile, but that's a little discussion for a different time. A little more complicated
Okay.
there. Uh, these guys here,
Is that the is that the rook?
they're the bishops.
The bishops. Good
Anything
to
on
know.
movement? Remember anything there?
Uh, they can move like any number of squares, right?
They can.
Like diagonally,
Exactly.
and they
That's
can jump
exactly it.
without jumping, without
Yes.
being able to jump.
Perfect. They're like I think of them as snipers sometimes because they're great from long range. Um,
Good to
so
know.
if you want to what we call develop them, sometimes like I'll play pawn there. My opponent will play I don't know pawn here just to match it. And now I have the bishop on this long diagonal. So like that's maximizing the opportunity to basically see different squares. Um, so they
Interesting.
work best, as we mentioned before, in kind of open areas. So if they're
Okay.
blocked off by like a pawn there, well now the vision stopped just kind of these two squares. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Yep.
And you're going to start the game with one dark square. So when I say dark squares, like all of them that I'm highlighting here, bishop, and one light square bishop. And they're never going to be able to change colors. So that's one good way to remember it. And together they can work really powerfully because if you have them, like, let's say, next to each other,
Hmm.
you can have. I'm just moving pieces for the point of that, showing the bishops here, but like these two, like this one here, light square, or I'm sorry, dark square is going to control everything from there, and light square, like everything here. So together, like there's so many squares that are next to each other that'll take away movement from my opponent.
Okay.
The other thing I should ask too is, do you remember? Did you hear about material counts at all?
No, I have
Okay,
not.
so it's a really high level way of kind of counting pieces. So a pawn is going to be worth 1 point in material. So it's like you'll want to trade a pawn for a pawn because they're going to be
Okay.
worth 1 point. A bishop is worth three. So theoretically, they're worth 3 pawns. Now, the reason I say theoretically is like these are not hard and fast rules. It's all situational. There's points where a pawn is going to be better than a bishop. It
Okay.
depends on what's happening on the board. And again, this is not something I expect you to remember, quickly. And just to say in general, like I'm going to say so much here, I would never expect a beginner level player to retain all of it. It's just, when you practice these things over time and you start to try to take them away and get a feel for a good move or a bad move or a trade of pieces you should or should not make, those sorts of things.
Sure.
So throughout
Awesome.
this, ask questions away, make sure you're understanding
Absolutely.
to the best of your ability.
Cool.
So those are bishops. I know you mentioned before the L-shaped guys here, the ponies, the knights. They are complicated. So a first move could be for me knight to f3, meaning from g1 to f3.
Mhm.
They're going to move in that L shape. They're always going to move to a different color square. So do you know where they're, again, theoretically most powerful?
No.
So there's going to be in the center. So like these two, when I say center, I mean these four are the central squares, but you have kind of a ring outside of that as well. And the
Mhm.
reason for that is that's where they can cover the most space if you think about it. So like if I have, and again, just to move a piece, so I have like this is controlling every square that I'm highlighting here, it could theoretically move to. And sometimes in chess, it's not the square that you're on that you're controlling, but it's more of the squares that you can attack you control because if my opponent were to move a piece there, I could take it immediately. But my opponent
You
could also
always
take the square I'm on technically, so I'm not totally controlling that. It depends how you're speaking about it, but that's kind of the way you want to think about it.
kind of always looking for the next move.
Exactly, and you can't. Your opponent isn't going to move a piece onto a square that you control, knowing you can take it, unless they have a reason for it.
Okay.
So when you see a knight in the center, that means it's generally a powerful knight. The other thing that's going to make them really unique is that they can jump over pieces. So they're also worth 3 points of material, like I was saying about bishops. But the biggest difference is the bishops have that advantage in range when the knights have the advantage in being able to jump over pieces. So when a bishop can't really look anywhere in a closed position, meaning like we have pawns in the center, just again moving for example, like a bishop can't do anything. It can take these pawns obviously, but if they're going to be protected, it can't, and it's going to be cut off. But a knight is really going to thrive in those closed positions because it can just jump around and kind of maneuver to a good spot.
Okay.
Is that making sense?
Yeah, that's making sense.
So people are going to compare um, bishops and knights quite often just because they're worth the same amount of material, but their roles is, I want to say opposite, but very, very different.
That is definitely good to know.
Okay, so next we have, can you name that guy?
That that has to be the rook, right?
That is the rook, yep.
Okay,
Do you
cool.
remember the movement pattern?
Horizontally or vertically, any
Yes,
number.
exactly,
They can't jump
perfect.
though.
So they're worth 5 points of material. So you'll already note that pawn one, these two guys are going to be three. So we're
Mhm.
looking at a more powerful piece. And the tendency is often to get them involved like really early on because they're more powerful. They can cover a lot of squares. But the pro tip from me not being a pro is that you need to keep them kind of in a reserve protective defensive area for almost as long as possible. And we'll talk about that as we get into games, but they have a great deal of power, and especially later in the game. But a lot of the power they come from is protecting your king.
Okay, good to
I
know.
think that's as
Awesome.
much as I need to mention about them. But yeah, just their ability to move in open space is just their real value.
Okay,
And last but not least, highlight these two. These
that
are the
must
queens.
be the queens.
Yep.
Okay.
And do you remember how they can move?
Let's see. Do I took a few notes earlier?
So to say, you can Google it real
Um,
quick.
yeah, diagonally, horizontally, or vertically, any number of squares. They
Exactly.
also cannot jump over.
So they're super powerful, basically, is what we're trying to tell you.
Okay.
Another tendency of beginner players is to get them involved as early as possible, be very aggressive. It generally doesn't work, and especially for beginner players, I do not recommend it. It often just leads to silly mistakes. But They're going to be the piece that you want to attack with most because they cover the most ground and the most areas, I should say, just the most kind of directions. It's just doing it in a patient, calculated way instead of just let me throw my queen at you.
Yeah, I can see how that could get ugly.
Yeah, exactly. So the next thing to cover, you remember, I remember you mentioned earlier how you win the game. You want to remind
Yeah,
me?
it's capturing the king.
Exactly. So the king is the one you want to protect. Let's talk about there's three phases of the game. So you have the opening, the middle game, and the end game. So for our focus, probably just even for today, is going to be the opening kind of to the middle game. Now, opening obviously is just the beginning of the game.
Hmm.
What you want to do there's three principles. They're not hard and fast rules. They're just principles that'll allow you to get what we call a better position. Position meaning like the setup of the pieces on the board, basically. Your pieces are in a better position than your opponents, is what you want to leave the opening with. So those three principles are you want to develop your pieces. So what I mean by that is you want to get one, two, three, four, which are both bishops and both knights, off your back rank, which is your back row. You want to try to use them to grab a lot of space towards the center and really throughout the board to try to kind of constrict the number of squares your opponent can take over. So it's just kind of a land grab a bit. You want to attack the center. So that one goes along with the one I just said about developing your pieces. And normally that often means getting your pawns in the center as well. So for example, like if I play pawn here, I'm technically controlling that square there. I mean, I'm controlling this square because I have a piece there, but already I'm kind of jousting into the center there.
Hmm.
Another approach, but I wouldn't recommend it at a raw beginner level, is controlling through kind of like bishops, let's say. So for example, here to here, this bishop is controlling a lot of squares. But I prefer to play pawns in the center rather than trying to get bishops to kind of range pieces there.
Gotcha.
That was rule number two. And the third one is prepare to castle. Do you remember, or did you hear about castling at all?
No, I have not. That's new.
Okay, perfect. So castling, the name of the game really is king protection. So castling is a way to get your king into extra protection. So as you noticed, it starts kind of towards the middle of your back row. And I'm going to play through some opening moves here. And what we call opening moves often is they say book, meaning that there's like books about them, that they're very common, they're standard, if you will, which
Hmm.
are good to learn as a beginner if you know is something that really interests you. But they're normally always going to follow those kind of beginner steps that I was saying. They're going to allow you to develop your pieces. They're going to attack the center. And with those openings, they're going to get you in a position to castle. So let me walk through. So let's say if I play pawn to e4, my opponent responds pawn to d5. And all these book openings are going to have different names. So I'll play what's called the Scotch game, which is just a great name in itself. My opponent's going to match knight to
Sounds nice.
f6.
I like that.
So to walk through, yeah. So to walk through, the idea with the opening too is to just to kind of understand kind of what's going on. So I'm going to stop here for a second. And a lot of black's move, the black back pieces are going to be to kind of be in response of the player with the white pieces. So even to go back. So pawn, pawn. This is, you know, if black plays pawn to e5, that's going to stop the progress of the white player's e-pawn. Meaning I can't go any further and it's matching it. He's now attacking these squares. So we're both doing a quick land grab. Knight to
Okay.
f3. That's moving this piece towards the center. It's developing it, meaning getting it off the back row there. It's attacking two good squares here. Um, all of those things. But it's also, again, attacking this pawn here. So black's move to play knight to f6, I'm sorry, knight to c6 is to defend that pawn, but it's also developing it there. So a lot of the moves are going to have multiple purposes kind of throughout. Does that make sense so far?
That definitely makes sense. Yeah.
Any questions at this point? I know I'm moving quickly.
No, not at all.
Okay. So the follow up here for white is to play pawn to d4. And this is introducing an exchange, because remember how this is how the black pawn can take. I'm showing
Yeah.
on the screen there. So for example, in the normal opening here, black will take, and then the knight can move. So we'll take this way. This knight will take back. And you have to remember with these exchanges, they're all for pieces of the same material value. So no one's really getting ahead. No one is
Okay.
really getting a lead in material. They're exchanges and again, exchange of pieces and kind of trading there. But as we
And
go
can
here,
only
go ahead.
sorry to interrupt. It
No, go
can
ahead.
only the same pieces take out like pieces or stronger
No, it
pieces.
can be any piece taking any piece, and that's why the queen at times can almost become a liability, is when she becomes attacked. If the piece attacking is protected, let's say there's like a bishop that's protected attacking my queen, I'm not going to be able to take it. I actually have to move out of the way generally.
Okay.
So again, it's like liability in the sense that like I have to go out of my way to protect her instead of always attacking with her.
Good to know. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that.
So when you see kind of the development here is we're getting, as white, we're getting our pieces developed in the center. We have the pawn on e4 here, our queen's on e4, which we'll probably want to move fairly soon, but we also have 1, 2, 3 on the back rank we still want to develop. And for black, 1, 2, 3 that need to be developed. So we're getting a bit into the opening here. So it's black's move, a common move, and again, I don't expect you to remember all the moves going on, but it's just getting used to the ideas of what the players are trying to do. So
Perfect.
black will play knight to f6. This is attacking that pawn there. If I take with the queen, there's the option to take back with the queen, take with the pawn. With the queen being worth 9 points, which I was forgetting to mention earlier,
Mhm.
and this knight only being worth 3, like that's never a trade you want to make. Basically, a queen for the queen in most cases is the only trade worth making with a queen,
Okay.
just for value's sake. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I know you
Oh,
said
go
the
ahead. Go
queen
ahead.
is 9 material points, if that's the term. What would the king be?
The king doesn't necessarily have. They say like one or
Because it's just
two.
the game.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's game over if you lose, it's like an absolute value of like that is what it is. It is the game. So it's
Gotcha.
because you can never
Perfect.
like trade a queen or I'm sorry, a king for another piece. So
Okay.
it's kind of yeah, you don't really talk
Gotcha.
about the king with material, but that's a really good question.
Perfect.
So this is where with this opening, it kind of starts to get just playing sound kind of fundamental moves. So again, I have 1, 2, 3 on my back rank here, and I want to try to develop them. Try to get them towards the center and get them off the back row. So good moves here would be like knight to c3 for black. We can play bishop to e7. We're all just trying to do the development things here. That looks like a blunder according to the. You see this bar on the left side of the screen? It says 2+2.89,
I do not.
right
Let me
next to the
see.
left of the board. There's a bar. Anyway, what that is a valuation by a computer of the position. So
Interesting.
the
I'm
move
not
that
sure
white
if I'm paying
played, you
that.
can only see it when you're doing analysis. You'd never be able to see it during a game because it's
Oh,
basically
okay.
cheating type of thing. I'm just naming basic moves, but the move I made there for black was a mistake according to that. But we won't pay too much attention at this point because we're trying to focus on basics.
Good to know.
So again, I have these two pieces here to develop. And now both players can do what's called castling. So if you have no pieces between your king and your rook on either side of the board,
Hmm.
like I'm highlighting, and neither of them have moved, so neither the king nor the rook, and you're not in check, you can move the king over. On the king side, it's 2 spaces. So I'll do it with both, actually. We'll do the black first, and then the white. And what that does is it's going to move over 2 spaces for the king. You're going to have the rook jump onto the other side of the king, and that is a much more protected space. You want the king kind of towards the corner there. The rook is always going to be next to it. You have these 3 pawns in front of it as protection. And when you finish that basic development, let's just make a move here, and then we'll play bishop to there. And you'll notice these moves that I'm playing, they're always to a square. Let's say, for example, the bishop here is going to be protected by that pawn, this pawn here on f2.
Hmm.
When I move this bishop here, the one on d3, it's protected by that pawn on c2. The knight being on c3 is protected by the pawn of b2. Does that idea of protection make sense to you?
Definitely makes sense.
Okay, there's always
Yes.
something backing it up, basically. So if a piece were to come in and take this knight right here, that pawn could always take it back, basically.
Okay.
So an undefended piece, meaning like I could just take it with no repercussion, like my opponent couldn't take me back after, that's called hanging. Like if black were to play um, knight to h5 there, that's called that knight is hanging right now. Like I don't have a piece that can directly attack it, but if I did, that would be a hanging piece.
Okay. So
And just to show you one more thing here. So like white has a solid position here. The computer says it's basically even. Both sides are even, and black would actually play. Okay, so after black's move, white is better. We don't have to figure out why right now. But basically, both players have their pieces developed. They're off the back row there. So for white, we have what's called the rooks are connected, meaning there's nothing between them. So a player would never be able to take one rook without the other. I'm sorry, they'd never be able to take one rook without another piece taking the other rook back. Like they're always
Okay.
protecting each other. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Yeah.
And then for black, the queen can move out of the way, and then the rooks would be protected there too. So this is like an ideal setup. Like maybe it's not perfect, you're not winning the game, but this is just fundamentally sound for both players.
Interesting. Good to know.
This is
You're
what you
always
want to
set up
do.
for the next move.
What's that?
Just from what I'm taking away, you always want to be set up for the next move
Yeah,
in
you
a
want to.
position to
It's not
counter.
always that the winning moves are like the really good moves. It's not a fight in the sense where like you're always looking for a knockout punch, and especially as you improve, you're looking to just kind of increase your position on the board. You're looking to just kind of move forward. It can be slowly, even like a snake, for example, where you're just kind of slithering your way in. You're making better
Mhm.
moves, and you're just starting to constrict your opponent. It takes a lot of practice to get to that point where the moves you're making are kind of slowly taking away, and it takes a lot of thought to be put into them. But that's kind of the patient improving approach of like I'm not just looking for cheap tricks. I'm really, playing sound chess and improving.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way at looking at it. Just kind of always being ready for what's ahead and putting yourself in a good position
That's
one day at a
exactly it.
time.
Yep. Yeah,
Cool.
you always just want to be setting yourself up for success. And now that I say that, it's reminding me the way, and this is a really corny way of looking at it, but I think of like attacking in chess, it's kind of a team sport because you have all these pieces and you always need to line them up, have one be protecting the other. They have to work as a team. And I know I mentioned before, like a beginner player will move out their queen right away because it's the most powerful and try to attack. But that's not the best approach. You always have to have your pieces working in unison. And to
Mhm.
prove that, a lot of like really good players, um, they'll play against players that are not nearly as good as them, and they'll play like down a queen on purpose. Like they'll start off the game without a queen, just to prove by what they call coordinating your pieces, just kind of again having them move in unison is much more powerful than just one piece, the queen. Even she'll become a liability at times because of all that.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
I could probably use all the help I could get in a situation like that.
If we played a quick game, I would give you my queen for sure at this point.
Cool.
Um,
All right.
but these are the basics. I'll go back to give one more example of castling, just so we can see. I don't know why we're not moving back. Okay, there we are. That was weird. It was super laggy. Okay, so let me go back to right before both players castled. You can castle what's called long. The way that I showed castling there was castling short, meaning like short side of the board, because here we have one, two, three squares. Other way we have one, two, three, four. So white's move there, and I'll just make a quick move for black. We'll play that move for white, and then here we can move our king over three squares. I think we can. I don't know why it's not doing it. I'm sorry. Why? Oh, because it's not our move. And now we castle the other way. See how that's a little bit different?
Mhm. I see.
And let me just cancel out of something that popped up on my screen. Yeah, so it's when you castle short, you only have one square and then the corner, because I'll show it again with black here. And then when you castle long, you have two squares. So this is what we call an example of crossboard castling, meaning both players castle different ways on the board. And these are generally, say, more fun games. They're generally action packed, meaning there's a lot of attacking going on. Because what happens is, and again, this is very general level, but both players will start to kind of want to launch their pawns towards their opponent's king. So, like for black, they'll want to launch one, two, three, four towards the white king, and for
Okay.
white, one, two, three, four towards the black king. So the player that can kind of get more momentum going will have a better chance of winning because the player, if you're stuck defending, you're just not going to be able to launch your pawns as quickly. When I say launch, I just mean moving towards,
Okay.
because even if I can get to trade, let's say, my three pawns for your three pawns there, your king is going to be open. Like those files are going to be open, and the more open they are, the more I can attack. Does that
Gotcha.
at a basic level make sense?
Yes, it does. Yep.
Perfect. There was one other thing I wanted to mention that I was reluctant to earlier. The when you get a pawn to the end of the board, do you know what happens?
Um, I may have covered that, but I do not exactly recall,
So it's
unfortunately.
called promotion, meaning that you can have the pawn turn into any piece you want other than a king. So in most
Interesting.
circumstances, it's going to turn into a queen because that's going to be the most powerful. There's a select number of circumstances. Maybe a knight will be better, maybe a rook, but they're very few and far between.
So any piece, I imagine, not king, or
Not
is that
exactly, not
correct?
a king. You can't have
Not a
two
king.
kings because
Okay.
that just throws everything off.
Yeah. That
That's the one
sounds
thing
like
I wanted
tyranny.
to mention there. And I'm trying to think if this is a good place to jump in and maybe have you start playing a game. And not that I expect things to be fully articulated, but it's one of those things after you learn the basics is that you can't really learn how to swim by talking about it. You gotta jump in the pool type of thing.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. I'm gonna stop
I read
recording
up
for.
on
Go ahead. Go
okay,
ahead.
cool.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I read up on everything. I think I played on a different account, like a quick game.
Hmm.
But obviously this has been a lot more helpful. I think that just me jumping into a game without this background knowledge didn't really do much for it. So
No, no, not at
this
all.
has been great.
I guess any other questions before you would want to feel comfortable playing a game?
No, not really until I put things in action.
Yeah,
Everything's been pretty clear. I'm sure it's all going to be learned over again once I start, but
exactly.
that's the purpose.
And I think that once you get the fundamentals down and you start to play with them, like the best way to improve is just playing with thought. Like not just moving the pieces as quickly as you can or anything like that. And it's very tempting when you have quicker time control games, meaning quicker just time on the board, like 1 minute or 3 minute or 5 minute. If you're a more experienced player, you can play those with a pretty decent level of quality. But if you're still learning different attacks and things like that, they're just not a helpful game type to play. So
Perfect.
it's really thinking through your moves, figuring out patterns, and chess is so much of pattern memorization that you just like that's why I can play quickly because I can and again there are millions of players better than me. I'm not bragging about my level, but my point is that you can at least start to recognize patterns just with the blink of an eye. Like you just get used to them. You say, "Oh yeah, when I move
Yeah,
this piece here,
yeah.
that one there." And to someone who doesn't understand them, it looks truly incredible. And I think that's one of my favorite parts about the game is,
So yeah,
you
I mean,
this. Go ahead.
sorry to interrupt. No, no, I was just gonna like what you're saying right there kind of clicks because I was watching something 60 Minutes with Magnus, and he was talking about like I think Kasparov or whoever it was before him who was the greatest. Like he could just memorize his patterns and what he had done in like a random tournament in 1988 and all
Yeah.
that. So clearly there's a big edge to patterns in this game.
Yeah, a lot of the top level players do so well with memorization too. So you may have heard of playing blindfold. I can actually do that where all I can literally put a blindfold on, and if I have someone announcing out, let's say your moves, and you
Hmm.
respond to your moves and just telling me like pawn to e4, like I basically can visualize the board and imagine what's where, and I will call out my move in response. I can't do it against really, really good players, but against basic level players, I can definitely do it.
So that's pretty impressive
It's just
actually.
visualization. Yeah, it's easier than you would think. I'm not saying it's easy to do, but it's definitely a cool trick. Um,
Cool.
but yeah, like grandmaster level players, they one way they become that good is just they look at past games of legends and they remember what happened where and the moves they played and that's exactly it. Someone will approach Magnus, be like, hey, like they'll show him a position on the board and like, can you name the game and what tournament or what year it happened in? And a lot of the time he can very easily answer, like, oh yeah, that was Kasparov in '95 in
That's
XYZ
wild.
tournament.
Yeah,
Um,
there is definitely a lot of thought that goes into this game. That's something I've
it's a
gathered
full
in
time job
my
for someone
limited
of that level.
research. For sure. Yeah.
It's cool to study as well as learn.
Absolutely.
All right, so let me stop here.